Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Dr. Tommy Woods, I found you on Dr. Andy Galpin's podcast, a fantastic episode on, I think, his last season. You've got quite the background. I mean, this is only a sliver, but degree in biochemistry, medical degree from the University of Oxford, PhD in physiology and neuroscience. You're a performance consultant for professional athletes. I know you do a lot with high-level race car drivers.
Yeah.
I think is it Formula One? I think you
Formula One, yeah.
Several Olympians, world champions, but this one's big. So you've got a book coming up. It's called The Stimulated Mind, and its subtitle is Future-Proof Your Brain from Dementia and Stay Sharp at Any Age. Like, I'm in fitness, heart disease, all this other stuff scares me. Nothing scares me more than the idea of dementia. So
yeah.
We're going to dive deep in this. It's an honor to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about all of that with you.
Okay, so first fun one. Are video games beneficial for preventing cognitive decline?
Potentially, yes. Which is a little bit, maybe is unexpected. Let's say, I was going to say controversial. Maybe it's unexpected. So there are now several studies and even like meta-analyses, like very rigorously done on a wide range of different video games, suggesting that particularly first-person sort of complex world type video games can improve multiple aspects of cognitive function in both younger individuals as well as older individuals. So there are studies looking at like Super Mario 3D World. That's been done in a bunch of different studies, actually. But then also even like first-person shooter, like action-style video games. And I think it's because they're, complex worlds. They require you to develop like complex motor patterns, complex motor skills. Often you're doing some kind of problem solving. Maybe there's even a social component, right? You're playing Call of Duty or something with other people, right? You're having to strategize, as well as respond very quickly to inputs coming from this environment that you're inhabiting. All of these things can then help to either boost or maintain certain sort of fundamental cognitive functions like decision making and processing speed. And then over time, that could absolutely translate to a slowed rate of cognitive decline. There's a very interesting recent study called Creative Experiences and Brain Clocks. And what they did is they looked at lots of these different complex skills that humans can develop expertise in, like dancing and languages and art. But one of the sets of studies they included were video game studies, as randomized controlled trial type studies. They used StarCraft 2 was the video game that they played in these studies. But what they showed is that all these different complex skills that we can do, including video games, help to maintain the function of some of the networks in the brain that are susceptible to aging and kind of contribute to cognitive decline. So yes, video games can be a tool in that toolkit.
I think there's two big components that we'll get into. It's the early building of, and I'll get you in a moment to define headroom. So I think it's actually very similar to the idea of building muscle reserve, bone reserve on the physical side of our health. But this is cognitive reserve in a way. So I guess in this context, do you think that the video games potentially have an ability to help build the peak cognitive headroom? Or is it a better like late stage intervention to try to minimize the rate of decline? Or is it really going to contribute to both?
Yeah, I think it's going to contribute to both. And here maybe I'll kind of define this idea of headroom. So this is something that I took from economist Art Devaney, who was talking about evolutionary fitness and and sort of like the fundamentals of true longevity, like 30 plus years ago, that, the kind of things that people are really talking about now. But it's basically headroom you think of as the difference between the function you need to just like survive day to day and the maximum capacity and function that you have access to, right? So your lower body leg room is the difference between the amount of strength you need to like get up out of a chair or get up off the toilet versus your max back squat, right?
Mm.
That's your headroom. And you want that to be as big as possible, right? Because then that's preventing falls and other issues that happen as you get older. And so the brain is essentially the same. We want to have as much capacity available to us when we need it. And that's when we're stressed, when we're sleep deprived, as we start to age and we start to lose some function, which we all will at some rate. And so there are, if we look at some of these fundamental cognitive functions that we need for, day to day, they are things like sustained focus and attention, short-term memory, being able to process information rapidly, so processing speed. And in many ways, the right kind of video game challenges those functions, right? Challenges sustained attention, challenges rapid decision making, maybe even challenges some aspects of strategy and working memory. And so that then helps us build those functions that we can then use out sort of in the day-to-day world. There are some studies that suggest that kids who do some gaming do perform better on some cognitive tests. And then we have randomized controlled trials in adults, young adults, older adults, individuals with different mental health conditions, so depression, for instance. All of those show some potential benefits from these complex video games. So it's not going to be like a panacea, but certainly they seem to challenge some of these fundamental aspects of cognitive function that then help to build capacity.
A quick break from this episode to shout out RP Strength and the RP Hypertrophy app. I have a big confession. I've never used a coach before. I've always auto-regulated my training for decades. But I've known Dr. Mike Isertel and Nick Shaw, the founders of RP, for years, and I'll get behind anything they create, including years of reading their books, consuming their media, attending their seminars, and having them as guests on the show. And I've been using the RP Hypertrophy app now for several months. And several things have happened. It forced me to make smaller and more gradual but better increases in weight volume across time, like putting 5-pound plates on each side of a leg press. Who does that? Never before. Only 45s. It cut out the jump volume. It made my workouts faster and more efficient. I show up with a plan. I didn't have to think about what to do. I feel more accountable having logged my progress. And I don't skip things because I don't feel like it. If hiring a one-on-one coach isn't for you, using the RP Hypertrophy app is the next best thing to manage your gains and to take the guesswork out of your program. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free, and if you don't like it, they'll give you your money back. And I've also got you a $50 US dollar discount, so go to rpstrength.com/coats and use the code COATSRP, or go to the link below in the show notes. That's rpstrength.com/coats and use the code COATSRP. And I suppose to this, it's not that it's it could be probably net positive or net negative, because you get the person who, like me growing up, played a lot of video games, a lot of sports, really excelled in school, studied that side of stuff, outdoors a fair bit. And my parents encouraged us to be very active, fed us nutritious food. So it fit into a big puzzle. Whereas I think there's going to be a subsection of population that is socially isolated, hides within video games as a coping mechanism, and maybe there's some other maladaptive. They're certainly not physically active. It's not a lot of sunlight. So it's going to be net positive in its own context, but is it also a symptom of a bigger problem, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that this is, you've really sort of nailed onto the part that makes the biggest difference, right? Is the overall context. So there have been, for decades now, people talking about this idea of digital dementia, right? As technology expands, as we spend more and more time on devices, we're going to erode our cognitive function. And this is absolutely possible. But when you look at what they're particularly concerned about, it's that by spending all our time doing these other things like social media, video games, it's the net negative is going to come if we're doing that at the expense of all the other things that you mentioned, right? True, play, physical activity, as kids, play, physical, or as adults, physical activity, a nutritious diet, proper sleep, right? True, real in-person social connection. If you're spending 18 hours a day playing video games inside in the dark and not doing those things, that's 100% going to be a net negative. But if it's this thing that fits into a bigger picture with all these other aspects that we know are important, then I think it could be a net positive.
Okay. And I think the other thing I took away from what you described with Headroom, I think perhaps we thought about dementia as sort of a binary. You either have it or you don't. Whereas
Mm,
Headroom really, I love the analogy with physical capacity, and thinking about it in terms of independence. The more peak muscle, bone, motor control skill, all this sort of stuff that we develop in early life, the slow and then continue to be active, the slower the rate of decline as we get older,
yeah.
and the more likely we stay above this line of independence. We often
Mm,
see this on a graphical image in our world. But a lot of people end up, they don't build a peak capacity. It could be bone health and risk.
mm.
It could be just muscle and motor control. And then earlier in life, they cross below this line of independence, and then, they are not able to. So I now am thinking about cognitive decline in the very same way. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely. So in my book, I have several graphs that essentially show that, right? So dementia is an end state of loss of cognitive function where you get to the point where you're no longer able to look after yourself on a day-to-day basis, right? Um, but for many people, that requires a significant decrease in cognitive decline that may occur over, decades potentially. Um, so it really is thinking about how do we maximize the peak, and we know, for example, um, like how more broadly how we use our brains is the primary determinant of the capacity that we build. And so the peak of cognitive function tends to occur around the time we leave formal education.
Mm.
So the higher your educational attainment, on average, the higher and later your peak of cognitive function. Um, and so those who have higher levels of educational attainment, they experience dementia later because they've started from a higher peak, right? So you have to lose more function before you get to that diagnosis of dementia. That it doesn't necessarily mean that your the decline is slowed. So the decline depends on what you do later,
Mm.
right? So this is like you said, you want to build capacity and then maintain activity to maintain that function. So both are important, but you really can think about it the same way. Build as much capacity as you can, and then do whatever you can to continue to maintain that capacity for as long as possible.
Now, and you acknowledge this in the book. uh, there is data that points to people with formal, especially post-secondary education.
Mm,
There's two other things. One is it doesn't necessarily need to be formal.
mm.
And two, let's bring in these social determinants of health, because there are a lot of things that correlate with the people who go and do post-secondary education, right?
Yeah, well, 100%. And both of those things are critical to consider. So, the first question, I don't think that um, educational attainment or that process of learning has to come from formal education, right? You can do forest school, homeschool. However, I think all of that is going to have the same or similar benefit. What I think matters the most is this process of active learning and truly engaging with and developing skills and knowledge. How you do that, I don't think it matters, because we see similar effects later in life when you start to develop a new skill, learn music, a sport, or something like that. We see improvements in cognitive function, and this is outside of formal education, right? So I think it's just that engagement with learning. You're sort of like essentially professionally training your brain. That's what you're doing as a student. How you do that, I think, matters less. In the research, educational attainment matters more than time spent in education, because it tells you that this person is gaining mastery over the things that they're doing. But again, I don't think that has to happen. That has to happen like in a traditional schoolroom. Then you're also absolutely right that different types of people get access to different types of education, right? I come from a very middle class academic background, which is why I then get to go to medical school and do a PhD and all that kind of stuff.
Mm.
So that absolutely plays a role. And socioeconomic factors are some of the strongest predictors of long-term dementia risk, because of stress, access to healthcare, access to nutritious food, access to education, all this kind of stuff. So I think that's part of that signal. But even
Mm.
beyond that, when as much as we can account for that, as access to education has improved, dementia risk has declined in parallel at the population level. So, for instance, in countries that have more recently giving better access to education to women, their risk of dementia has declined in parallel. So yes, some of it is societal, some of it is socioeconomic, but even then, I think the sort of like fundamental principle of spending most of your time training your brain seems to then have, you know, these broader long-term impacts.
Fantastic answer. How can we decrease long-term risks of dementia?
So the way that I think about this, because there are lots of things that become important. I came up with this mental model for how I think about all these different risk factors for, well, it's both risk factors for dementia, but it's also just like, what are the fundamental things that the brain needs in order to function at its best? And these core principles are the same regardless of whether you're developing a brain, whether you're trying to build a foundation for elite performance, whether you're trying to recover from an injury, whether you're trying to prevent dementia. Like, these same things remain critical. So I built, or I created and wrote down that something I call the 3S model. So the 3 S's are stimulus, supply, and support. As a fellow meathead, you'll probably appreciate that I kind of liken a lot of this to the idea of physical training, right? Because I think they're very similar. So if you want to build physical capacity, you want to build muscle mass or strength, the most important thing is that you have to apply some stimulus. You have to apply some mechanical tension to the skeletal muscle, right? Like, we know that that's the most important thing. If I want bigger biceps, I need to do bicep curls. But I can get more adaptation and more growth if I ensure high quality nutrition and I give myself like good rest and recovery, right? Like, that's when we know adaptations occur. But you can't just drink protein shakes and nap and get stronger muscles, right? So the stimulus is key. So stimulus is where I think it all starts. And we've kind of touched upon all the most important ones, I think, but it's basically social connection, skill learning, your languages, music, complex motor skills, open skill sports, all of that kind of stuff. Learning those and engaging with those and maintaining and using those skills across our lifetime is probably the most important thing, like driver of function. Then, once you've stimulated a certain region or network of regions across the brain, when those regions become activated, they essentially drive an increase in blood flow to those regions, right? You need to provide oxygen, glucose, or some kind of other energetic substrate. And so this requires healthy vascular function. There's this idea of neurovascular coupling, which is basically the neurons get activated, they ask the blood vessels to dilate, and they bring in more substrate. So cardiovascular risk and vascular health is super critical to kind of maintain that supply. Then you also need good metabolic health, because that helps to regulate energy availability. And you need good nutrient status, because there are certain nutrients that are kind of critical to all of this. So different vitamins, omega-3 fatty acids, those kinds of things, we know are associated with long-term risk of cognitive decline and dementia. So we need to like hit those. And then you've stimulated a network in the brain, you've brought in all the required substrate. In order for adaptation to occur and function to increase, you need some period of recovery, which is when that adaptation occurs, right? So sleep is probably the most important one. So sleep is like the primary pillar in the support bucket, which is the final bucket. But you can also help to support adaptation with other factors like trophic factors, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, hormones are important there as well. And you want to avoid things that kind of inhibit adaptation, like excess alcohol, smoking, your chronic stress, that it essentially creates this sort of overtraining type picture in certain parts of the brain that prevent it from ever being able to adapt. So those are the 3 S's: stimulus, supply, and support. And they also interact. So when you stimulate the brain more, either with like cognitive activity or with physical activity, you sleep better, right? And then when you sleep better, you change things like inflammation and blood pressure, and it makes you more social. So just by changing one thing in one bucket, because they all interact, kind of the whole network shifts in your favor. And the reason why I like to think about it like that is because it allows people to think like, okay, which of these buckets do I need to attend to a little bit more? What's the one thing in this bucket that I can start to work on? and then still appreciate that you're going to have an impact across the sort of whole picture of how your brain functions. Because otherwise you're left with like a list of 47 things for how to optimize brain health, and then you never know what to do, and so you don't do any of them. So that's kind of how I think about all those different bits, and we can kind of like dig into any of those as you like.
Perfect. Let's start here. What's beyond our control?
In terms of dementia risk?
Yes.
So, great question. I think that probably the biggest thing that's beyond our control is those other like societal socioeconomic factors that you already mentioned, right? Those are probably the biggest drivers of dementia risk right now that an individual probably does not have significant control over. And so that requires societal change that I certainly hope will happen in the coming decades. The next thing is that we still don't know what some of the risk factors and contributors to dementia are. So the field in general has been very focused on certain proteins that accumulate in the brain, amyloid and tau.
Amyloid plaques, yeah.
Yeah. And they're certainly a part of the picture, but the more time we spend looking at it, the more we realize they're just like just one part rather than like the whole picture. So we've been kind of hamstrung a little bit because we have this very singular focus on this one area. So there's still some parts of dementia that we don't necessarily know exactly how they're driven. And it's probably some complex interaction of things that we haven't quite figured out yet. Because depending on who you ask, if you ask the Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention, they say about 45% of cases of dementia are preventable. And that's including a lot of the things I've already mentioned. Other people say, or it might even be more than 70% based on analyses from the UK Biobank. But a lot of what they thought about was sort of like socioeconomic kind of drivers, again, that individuals might not have under their personal control. But that still leaves like a quarter that we don't know how we might try and tackle that. So there's a bit of a black box there. Beyond that, oh yeah, sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to say your book gives an incredible treatment to the history of the research, and in particular, as you mentioned, I guess this early research. I'll let people read the book to get into the nitty-gritty on it, but this amyloid plaque and tau focus, which dictated a ton of the research, which largely was like almost like a misleading path. So again, I'll let people go into the book to get really into the guts of that one. But please, you were going to say.
Yeah, so that's right, and I think we shouldn't discount it entirely, but I think we need to broaden our view if we want to tackle as much of this as possible. So, beyond those things that I think we don't yet have control over, or that we don't know what they are yet, the next thing that people might think about are genetics. So most of the evidence so far suggests that even genetics are potentially modifiable in a certain way. So there are two broad ways that somebody might look at their genetic, or actually three broad ways somebody might look at their genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease. So one is one very specific gene, the apolipoprotein E gene, or ApoE gene. And it comes in three different flavors, 2, 3, and 4. And those who have at least, and you get 2 copies of it, right? So you can have a combination of 2s, 3s, and 4s. And those who have at least one copy of ApoE4 have something like a 2 to 6 times increased risk of Alzheimer's. Those who have 2 copies, it's something like 6 to 20 times in sort of modernized, westernized societies. And I think that's an important point that I'll come back to. So that's one factor people can consider. The next is you can do these polygenic risk scores. So you look across thousands of genes and all these very small modifications, these small single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs, they can kind of add up to increase or decrease your overall risk of dementia. So that's another way to look at it. And then the third way to look at it is family history. So if you have somebody in your family who has dementia, you have an increased risk of dementia yourself. So for each of those, lifestyle and other modifiable factors still have a huge impact. So even if you do have elevated risk because of genetics, you can offset a lot of that, but through modifiable factors. So going back to ApoE4, there are several populations around the world where ApoE4 does not increase the risk of dementia and may even be protective in certain scenarios. So this is the Bolivian Chibane, the Nigerian Yoruba. There have been studies in indigenous Americans, and then also studies looking at people of Sicilian heritage in Sicily versus in America. And ApoE4 is only a risk factor for things like cardiovascular disease and overall mortality in America, and not if you're living in sort of like your more ancestral Italian native environment. So all of those things kind of suggest that there is an interaction between ApoE4 and the environment. And several other studies suggest that ApoE4 is mainly a risk multiplier. So if you have high levels of systemic inflammation that come from some kind of chronic disease process, or you drink a lot of alcohol, or you have a poor quality diet, or you're physically inactive, ApoE4 will make that risk even bigger for you when it comes to your long-term dementia risk. But on the other side of that is that you will benefit more from those things because you're ApoE4. So because if being sedentary and having ApoE4 increases your risk more than being sedentary and not ApoE4, then by the same token, if you're ApoE4 and you exercise, you're going to get a greater reduction in your relative risk of dementia, right? If you're ApoE4, if that makes sense. So this all suggests that the majority of your increased risk with ApoE4 can be negated if you sort of tick all these boxes from a healthy lifestyle standpoint. I won't say that they can all be ticked, or it can't be completely negated because we just don't know that yet. But everything sort of suggests that you can negate most of that risk. And then we see the same things with polygenic risk and family history. So people who have a high polygenic risk of dementia, they can still dramatically reduce their risk by instituting various healthy lifestyle factors, like all the things we've already talked about. And the final piece with family history is that often what drives a family history of dementia is shared environmental factors, in addition to shared genetics. So if you had family members who have dementia and they were sedentary, they didn't eat a particularly nutritious or high quality diet, they didn't sleep very well, you are likely to pick up those habits and carry them forward. So again, even though we might consider these genetics unmodifiable, you can still get a huge benefit and maybe larger benefit from lifestyle changes if you're at high genetic risk for dementia.
All right. So my friend Luca Hocevar will be thrilled to hear all this. So for context, and he is very public on his media about both of his parents have Parkinson's disease, and like last year, he lost his mother, right? So this is something near and dear. So I actually introduced you guys, and I know that you're also scheduled now to appear on his podcast because I knew he would love this. So everyone listening here, depending on when they're aired, go check that out even deeper, right? But I know he's passionate about this whole thing. He got excited when I put your book onto his radar. So let's get into, on the physical activity side of stuff, does the type and intensity of exercise matter? Because I know one of the things that seems to show up really well is dancing.
Yeah. So, and I think there's a very specific reason for that. And I'll sort of come back to that at the end. But
please.
So the answer is yes. The type and intensity does seem to have an effect, and different types of exercise seem to have different benefits for the brain, suggesting that we need a kind of a well-rounded program as much as we're able to do. So the biggest impact probably comes from moving from very little movement to some movement, right? And at that level, anything is great, right? Whatever it is, walking, dancing, you want to go lift some weights, like literally anything, just some exercise snacks, right? Take the stairs occasionally, that kind of stuff. Beyond that, we know that, so say people who frequently move throughout the day, sort of 8 to 12,000-ish steps a day, they seem to have the lowest risk of dementia associated with sort of like general kind of movement. So even just some low level activity like that can have a big benefit. One of the first studies that was ever done that showed that you could increase the size of the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that's really critical for memory and is sort of affected, especially late on in Alzheimer's disease. There was a study in the first time we saw that you could actually increase the size of the hippocampus in older adults, like in their 60s and 70s, was with a walking intervention. So these individuals were given a walking program where they worked up to 40 minutes of brisk walking 3 times a week for a year. And they saw significant improvements in hippocampal volume and function on a cognitive function test in line, and it kind of correlated with how much fitness they gained. So for people who aren't doing much, right, just some brisk walking several times a week can make a big difference. From there, so we know that that kind of aerobic type work is beneficial, but we also know that intensity matters. So there was a more recent study that took individuals and randomized them to, at similar sort of age, 60 to 70, randomized them to 3 different groups. So one was like a low intensity group, so like walking. One was a moderate intensity group, like jogging, and this was like 40 to 45 minutes, 3 times a week. And then there was a high intensity interval training group. So these guys did the Norwegian 4x4 program on a treadmill, which is 4 minutes at 85 to 95% of maximum heart rate with a 3-minute rest. And then they did that 4 times over. And they did that 3 times a week. Anybody who's done the Norwegian 4x4 will realize that this is a pretty brutal training program. But so they did it 3 times a week for 6 months. They saw the HIIT group, they actually only gained as much fitness as the jogging group. So it wasn't just due to improvements in fitness, but the HIIT group had by far the biggest benefits in terms of the structure of the hippocampus, the function of the hippocampus on a cognitive test. And those benefits were maintained for 5 years later. Like they followed these people up for 5 years. Like it's one of the best exercise studies I think that's ever been done. And so there is an intensity dependent component. And I think a lot of it is driven by lactate production. Lactate is this magic molecule when it comes to the brain. It gets into the brain and it switches on genes like brain-derived neurotrophic factor or BDNF, which sort of supports the plasticity and function of neurons in the brain. So I think there's some intensity component is important. At least occasionally, sort of working hard enough to generate some lactate. Then the next part is resistance training. And whereas sort of aerobic and sprint type activities seem to be particularly good for structures like the hippocampus for memory, resistance training is particularly beneficial for the white matter, which is kind of like makes up about 60% of the middle of our brain. And it's really critical for like fast connections between different parts of the brain and between the brain and the body. Really important for like rapid decision making. We call executive function, and resistance training seems to be particularly beneficial for white matter, probably because it stimulates the production of IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, which is really important for white matter. And there are again randomized controlled trials in older adults that show like 1 to 2 lifting sessions a week, something super basic like 6 to 8 exercises, 3 sets of 8. Just like the most basic thing you could do in any gym. That significantly improves the structure and function of the white matter. And then the final piece, like coming back to dancing, there are again several studies that show that doing some kind of complex open skill sport, which requires you to respond to the environment, react, strategize. So ball sports, team sports, board sports, martial arts. If you compare these to other activities that have the same level of sort of physical strain, right, in terms of like cardiovascular intensity or something like that, they have additional benefit for the brain, probably because they're these like complex coordinative cognitive tasks on top of the physical component. So this is where you could replace jogging with dancing, right? And actually dancing is one of the best evidenced interventions for both mental health and cognitive function across a range of different populations. And I think that's because it has a complex coordinative component. You're learning motor skills. There's a social component. There's a music component, and there's the physical activity component. And these all sort of like come together and have some sort of magic in combination.
This episode is brought to you by Just Bite Me Meals. I work long days and I won't compromise my client experience or sacrifice my workout, sleep, or nutrition. So I needed a quality and reliable meal prep service so I could save time on cooking and shopping and have more time for the stuff that matters. Net out the cost of groceries and the service isn't as much as you might think, and regular impulsive food delivery apps, eating out, that costs way more anyway. I get more meal variety and less dishes to clean, and I've been referring clients to Just Bite Me Meals for a long time, and I recently started ordering myself. Food is great. The beef brisket tacos are my favorite so far, and there's a lot of menu choice. Your calories and macros are listed. The portions are great. You can order custom meals. They deliver to your door, or you can pick up from their storefront. And I'm sorry to listeners outside of Alberta, but Just Bite Me Meals is currently just in Edmonton, Calgary, Grand Prairie, and Fort McMurray. Ordering from Just Bite Me Meals made my life easier instantly. And you can get 10% off on all your orders using my code, Andrew Coates Fitness, all caps, on their website. That's Andrew Coates Fitness, all capitals, or go to the link and the code in the show notes. And you mentioned music, and I'll just sort of throw it in there. It's mentioned in the book as well, but it makes sense that a lot of what you just described. I mean, it's the physical aspects of it are a little bit more micro than dancing.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot of complex coordinated, like it's sort of pretty dynamic. So playing music, from what I understand. Side quest, and this one I think is relevant. I talk about this one a fair bit. It's come up in episodes before, but the importance of independence, muscle, bone health in particular. Older adults, the increased risk of a fall and fracture injury. If you've fallen, and let's say you survive it, as I understand it, we see pretty accelerated rates of cognitive decline after this, because what ends up happening, this person no longer is doing nearly as much physical activity for a while they're healing from something significant, but it also cuts off a lot of their social interaction as well. So it robs you of a ton of the positive things at a critical time. Yeah. So it's just yet another incentive to be as strong as possible and build as much reserve early. I think these things, everything you've described, they all run concurrent. I think they compound so much that if you actually don't do them, you don't get all the benefits. It's so net negative. And I think it's so positive if you actually do all these things.
Yeah. So there's actually you can expand it out a little bit because you're right. You want to do everything you can to make sure that you don't have significant periods where you have to like lay in bed recovering. And this is, even more broadly than just falls, because there are very interesting studies, even in young people. You put them on 2 weeks of bed rest, significant decreases in physical function, significant decreases in cognitive function, just because you're no longer getting those inputs from the environment, right? But then you translate that onto somebody who's 60 or 70, like the biggest drops in cognitive function, like over time as we get older, happen during periods of significant illness. There was a study done here in Seattle that showed that they followed the same people for decades, and they found that there's like an average kind of slow decline in certain cognitive functions over time, but they kind of like step downwards if people experience a significant period of illness, and even more so if they had to be hospitalized. And yet some of this is probably related to the disease process itself, but a lot of it is just that you've spent all this time not doing anything, the body decreases function as a result, and then you never go back and work really hard to regain that function. You just assume that you're sort of, you assume it's aging, but it's really just because you spent these long periods of time not doing anything. And so we want to avoid that as much as possible.
Which makes sense, because the same thing happens with muscle in your physical capacity.
Exactly.
Why wouldn't it happen with the brain as well? I think the biggest underlying oversimplification is the brain works very similar to the body in terms of what it adapts to, and then especially if you take away the stimulus to maintain those adaptations. And I think we're getting all over the place. The book touches on this, but also the greater peak and the more complex and more challenging the capacity, actually the harder it is to maintain. It's like having an extreme amount of muscle mass. It's harder to maintain it, right?
Yeah. So there is some evidence to suggest that people who say do have higher levels of education, they may be at greater risk of decline in cognitive function, especially around retirement, because they maintain function with like the complex work that they continue to do, but because they've have greater capacity, they have more to lose if they then remove those stimuli. So there's kind of the downside of working hard to build more function is that then you have to keep working hard in order to maintain it.
Okay, there's two more things I want to do. We have a little bit of time. Let's do the retirement thing. So why is retirement potentially a bad idea?
So, in in the book, I basically say that retirement is the worst idea that the brain ever got exposed to. And it's a relatively new thing, right? Retirement
Mm.
wasn't really a thing sort of 120 years ago. Um, but it sort of became baked into our society for two reasons. One, it's to kind of it sort of is a financial thing, right? And you're trying to bring young people up. The population is expanding. You need them to have jobs, that kind of stuff. But then the other one is we just assumed that once you hit 60, and that was in the original retirements, people were made to retire at 60. We just assumed that like the human, by the time you're 60, you're essentially useless, and we just need to like stick you out the back where you won't cause any trouble. And that's just inherently completely wrong, especially nowadays when we're so good at keeping people alive and keeping people healthy into their 70s, 80s, and 90s. But we've kind of sort of just like embodied that in ourselves. We just expect significant decline as we get older. And so, we have this idea of retirement. And when we retire, we also think, well, we think two things. One, I've worked hard all my life. I would deserve a break, right? So I'm just going to sit in my favorite chair and watch my favorite TV shows. And then we know, based on all the stuff we've said, right, you remove that stimulus, you see a significant decline in function. And so there are several studies that suggest the time at retirement is another significant time when cognitive function starts to decrease, just because we're no longer receiving like the social and cognitive inputs that we would get from work. So that doesn't have to be the case. Like you're allowed to retire. Like, don't get me wrong. But you just need to make sure that you're replacing those same stimuli with other things, new skills, volunteering, teaching, making sure that you're still sort of engaging in the world in the same way, because it is a significant risk that otherwise, you'll go out less, you'll do less. And because of that, right, function adapts accordingly.
That makes a lot of sense. And again, I absolutely overwhelmingly think it's the primary driver. But then there's compounding factors like, let's say someone starts having health issues later in life that actually forces them to retire.
Yeah.
You now have this compounding thing that's going to cause a shit spiral for this person.
Yes, absolutely. So those studies that I mentioned, looking at retirement, they do adjust for medical conditions that might make you retire early, because that is a major confounding factor. But you're right. There's along with this idea that we expect function to decline as we get older, and because we expect it, we stop engaging in the things that will help to maintain function, because we're like, well, I'm going to lose function anyway. At the same time, we expect health to decline as we get older, and therefore we stop engaging in the things that help us to maintain health. So some of it's the process of aging, but a lot of it is how much we choose to continue to engage in the things that help to maintain health and function. But in order to do that, we need to also believe that continuing to do those things will be beneficial. And there's a huge amount of evidence that shows that if you maintain physically active, you maintain metabolic health in particular, you maintain cognitive and social activity, right? The norm should be that you maintain cognitive function, into your 70s and 80s and maybe even beyond.
And I look at my career as something I never want to retire from. I can't wait for people to dive into your book, because there's so much in here, like, a snake bite in Costa Rica, like just your athletic history. There's just so much. I'm going to tease people. We don't have time to go into it, but there's so much good in here. But I agree. I think that, not retiring, I don't ever want to retire. I'm going to make a joke, and I am as apolitical as people get. You will never get me talk about politics or complex social political things on social media. There is one exception where I think people should be forced to retire, and this is a bipartisan statement, is politicians. Okay, moving on. Do with that what you like. Oh.
No, so like in the run up to the last election, I had a podcast on my podcast about this, because people were debating the age of the candidates, and we were kind of like, well, if you maintain your health and you maintain cognitive and social engagement, right, you should be able to maintain function later into life. So you should judge people on like how they're actually functioning. In this particular case, that podcast didn't age that well. But But I think the principle is right. But I do well. I'm also very apolitical, but I generally think that if you want to be a politician, that should immediately discount you from being a politician. But that's like a separate thing.
Yeah, we're not going there. Okay, with the limited time we have left, does body weight matter for long-term neurodegenerative risk?
So yes and no. When you look at cognitive function and cognitive decline and body composition, then and measures of strength, we know that cardiovascular fitness and relative strength, so how strong you are for you, assuming that people who are bigger tend to be stronger, right? Those things matter most, right? So if you maintain a good amount of strength relative to your body weight and you maintain good cardiovascular fitness, that matters more than certain aspects of body composition. However, we know that if you get into a state of excess energy availability, which is usually expressed as metabolic syndrome, prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, elevated waist circumference, high blood pressure, high blood lipids, those are also significant risk factors for dementia. So if you maintain metabolic health and you maintain fitness and you maintain strength relative to whatever it means for you to be strong, then body weight doesn't matter. If you get to the point where body weight has increased and that's come with metabolic disease because of excess energy availability, then yes, there's going to be some risk associated with that.
All right, that absolutely makes a ton of sense. Is there any evidence that GLP-1 agonist medications have potential on this front?
Yes. Well, I'll say yes and no, but I think that there's some really interesting hope here. So the reason I say no is because there were a couple of studies run using oral semaglutide in individuals with Alzheimer's disease to see if it could help treat or prevent decline, and they didn't show any benefit. There's some potential issues there, right? One is that it's quite late on in the disease, right? And then the other is, what was the expected effect? Right? Some people think that the oral version doesn't work as well as the injected version. There's some question of where they were hoping for it to act. Are they trying to have it improve metabolic health, or are they trying for it to have a direct neuroprotective effect on the brain? So the neurons have GLP-1 receptors. This is one reason why we're testing certain GLP-1 compounds in my lab as neuroprotective agents. And so it might have been too late. It might have been the wrong formulation, etc. However, if we think about the fact that metabolic disease is one of the most significant risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and GLP-1s are exceptionally good at treating that, I think that at a population level, if you start early enough and you're reversing metabolic disease in midlife, I think that's going to translate to big decreases in dementia risk at the population level as well. Of course, two things remain important. One, you have to make sure that you're, maintaining muscle mass while you're doing that as much as possible. Even though, most suggest that, you lose muscle mass proportional to the mass that you would lose if you were in a caloric deficit of any kind. But resistance training, protein intake is going to be important. And then there are also people who eat so little when they're taking GLP-1s that they might not be getting in some of those critical nutrients for the brain. So making sure we maintain strength and muscle mass, making sure we maintain good nutrient intake. If we do that, I think there's actually huge promise for GLP-1s to decrease dementia at the population level.
And your book does a wonderful job. There's a big section on like energy and the brain and that sweet spot. Too much, everything you just said, a lot more depth. Too little, it's also potentially a problem too. So try to actually get your literally nutrition and your energy intake into that sweet spot.
Exactly.
Seems to have a huge impact long term.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any specific nutrients that you'd say, hey guys, it'd be worth at least paying attention to this, whether it's supplemental or in our diet?
Yeah. So the big ones that we have some of the best evidence for are B vitamins, particularly the B vitamins that affect homocysteine levels. So homocysteine goes up when you're either deficient or insufficient in some of these B vitamins. So that's B9, folate, B9, which is folate, B12, B6, and B2, which is riboflavin. And so if you can, your doctor should be able to measure, you can get a homocysteine level checked. For dementia risk, ideally you want to be at least below 11, if not below 10. And if it's elevated, those B vitamins are important. Other things that can help bring down homocysteine and are also important for like parts of the function of the brain include choline, maybe creatine, maybe betaine or trimethylglycine. So there are some options there depending on what people might need. But the B vitamins are the most critical of those. Then vitamin D. So not being insufficient, so having a vitamin D level than 30, definitely not being deficient, having a vitamin D level below 20. So supplementing with vitamin D if you need. Then omega-3 status is the next one that's critical. So again, you can measure it. If you do something like an omega-3 index, you want it to be at least above 6, or ideally above 8%. And so those are the major ones. And when you look at and then maybe the final one is iron. So if you're anemic, which is particularly important in women in the sort of perimenopausal period, a lot of the cognitive symptoms they might experience, they're often related to low levels of iron. So dealing with that if needed. Then other things to consider include magnesium and zinc. Most people don't get enough magnesium and sometimes zinc too. And then like a final thing I think about are the antioxidant polyphenols, things that you get from like colorful berries, coffee, tea, colored fruits and vegetables, even like roasted nuts and seeds. They have some of these same compounds as well. They seem to be particularly beneficial for the brain, and it's partly through improving gut health, partly through improving vascular health, as well as maybe direct effects in the brain. So there's like a ton of different options of places you can get them, but they seem to be kind of cool for the brain as well. But those initial vitamins, like those main things, vitamin D, B vitamins, omega-3s, iron, like those are the most important ones. And then the rest are sort of like build on them where you can.
Wonderful. I mean, I wish I had another hour here to go over this in more depth. Everybody, first of all, they can go find you on Instagram at Dr. Tommy Wood. It's Dr. Tommy Wood. Give them your website, your podcast. I know you'll also be appearing on Lucas' podcast, so go check that out. Yeah. Where else to go?
Yeah. So yeah, at Dr. Tommy Wood on Instagram, Dr. Tommy Wood, drtommywood.com is my website. The book has a website, thestimulatedmind.com. And then I have a Substack with my friend who's a neurologist, Dr. Josh Turknett, and we have a podcast on there. You can just sign up for the free version, like everything happens on the free version. And the URL for that is betterbrain.fitness. And you can follow us for all those things there.
Amazing. Again, I'm loving the book.
Thank you.
For everybody listening, this is a little bit of fun. So obviously there's no audiobook yet. And the timeline I had to do it, the PDF, I probably just could not have gotten through it fast enough. So you put me onto Speechify, which I hadn't heard of. So I love this service now. Holy shit. And it's this AI thing, and it'll scan a document, and then it'll actually read it to you. It's phenomenal. And you have a few choices of celebrities. So you could choose Paris Hilton, you could choose Gwyneth Paltrow, and I'm not really on board with the Goop thing, so Gwyneth's a no for me. Sorry, Gwyneth. I mean, you were great in the Marvel movies. Snoop Dogg is one of your options, and I almost went with Snoop Dogg, but John Rhys Davies, the actor who plays Gimli in Lord of the Rings. I've been a fan of him for years. He's in the Indiana Jones movies, just classic British accent. So that was my go-to. So I have Gimli from Lord of the Rings reading me your book. It's bloody spectacular. Everybody, please, for the love of God, go get this book. It's actually like I recently had my friends Brett Stolberg, his new book, Jonathan Goodman, his new book. They're phenomenal. And as great as those are, funny enough, sorry guys, I'm actually even more excited about this book just because I think there's so much in here that everybody would benefit. So please go get it. Coaches, everybody grab this book, share it around with people. And thank you for coming on, Tommy. This is amazing.
Thanks so much for having me. Really, really appreciate this. And yeah, like I said, we could have chatted for much longer, but hopefully there's enough there for people to sort of have some takeaways. And yeah, if they're interested in the book, I'd really appreciate if they picked up a copy.
Well, I promise I'll bring you back. We'll do another one of these. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.